The saloon doors banged open with a gust of hot afternoon wind, stirring dust across the warped floorboards. Inside, the laughter stopped cold as Amos Rourke stumbled onto the stage, whiskey bottle in one hand and 3 trembling girls in tow. His daughters, Ella, Ruth, and little June, stood barefoot and pale beneath the crude gaslight, their faces streaked with tears and dust. The oldest, Ella, barely 16, held her sister's hands tightly, her thin shoulders shaking though her chin stayed high. "Gents," Amos slurred, raising the bottle like a toast. "Today you ain't bidding on no cattle or horses. Today, it's something finer. 3 able-bodied girls, fit for chores, marriage, or whatever a man needs on his homestead." The room went still as men exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their chairs, shame creeping across their whiskey-warmed faces. Others, colder-hearted, leaned forward with interest. In the corner, quiet as a shadow, sat Thomas Hale, a rancher known more for his silent work ethic than his words. Widowed, raising 3 sons on a dusty stretch of prairie, Hale had never darkened a saloon's doorstep unless necessary. But today, something about the broken figures of those girls struck him deeper than he expected. Amos pointed to Ella first. "Strong back, this one. Can cook, sew, and keep a house running." He shoved her forward, and she stumbled but didn't fall. Ruth, 14, followed, eyes downcast, clutching her worn shawl. June, barely 9, tried to hide behind her sisters, her lower lip trembling. "Starting bid, $10 each, or 30 for the lot," Amos sneered, swaying where he stood. A few men chuckled darkly, others muttered curses beneath their breath, but no one raised a hand. Not yet. Thomas Hale stood slowly, his boots creaking against the floor. All eyes turned to him, surprised. He was not a man given to impulse. He set his hat on the bar and spoke in a voice rough but steady. "I'll take them." The room fell silent. Hale stepped forward, laying $30 in weathered bills onto the bar. "But not as slaves, and not as burdens. They'll have a home, meals, and if my sons are worthy of them, maybe someday wives." The saloon keeper, caught between relief and disbelief, nodded. Amos, half drunk and fully lost, waved his bottle and stumbled out without a word. Thomas turned to the girls, kneeling so his eyes met theirs. "Come along now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." For the first time that day, Ella allowed herself a single broken sob of relief as she took his hand and stepped into a life unknown, but finally hers to choose. The wagon ride away from town was silent except for the creak of wheels and the low hum of cicadas in the prairie grass. Thomas Hale held the reins steady, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him, the 3 sisters sat huddled together on a worn blanket, uncertain of what fate waited at the end of the trail. Ella kept her shoulders squared, though fear tightened her throat. Ruth wiped June's tears with the hem of her sleeve, whispering comforts she barely believed herself. They had been sold like cattle, after all. Why should this man be any different? Yet there was something in his silence. Not the coldness of indifference, but the steadiness of a man who spoke only when words mattered. As the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in gold and rust, Thomas finally broke the quiet. "You'll meet my boys soon. Eli, Abram, and Silas. They're good-hearted, though rough around the edges." He glanced at the girls, his voice softer now. "I won't force you into anything, but if you choose to stay, there's room at my table and work enough for honest hands." Ella stared at him, searching for a hidden catch, but found none. Ruth spoke first, her voice small but steady. "Why'd you buy us?" Thomas considered this, rubbing his thumb over the reins. "Because leaving you in that place would have been worse than any trouble 3 girls could bring to my home," They rode on as shadows stretched across the fields. At last, the Hale Ranch came into view, a modest house of rough timber, barns nestled beside rolling pastures, and smoke curling from a chimney. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cared for, and for the first time in days, the girls saw something that looked like home. The ranch yard bustled with movement as 3 young men approached, their boots dusty, faces curious but cautious. Eli, the eldest, wiped his hands on his shirt, brow furrowed beneath sun-bleached hair. Abram, lanky and sharp-eyed, leaned against the fence with a crooked grin. Silas, youngest and quietest, lingered near the barn, uncertain but kind. Thomas climbed down, his voice calm but firm. "Boys, meet Ella, Ruth, and June. They'll be staying with us for a time. Treat them like kin until they tell you otherwise." The brothers exchanged glances, then nodded, some awkward, some shy. Ella held her sisters close, still bracing for cruelty. But as the door opened and warm lamplight spilled onto the porch, she dared to believe, if only for a moment, that their story might not end in sorrow after all. The morning sun crept over the Hale Ranch, casting long shadows across the weathered porch, where 3 sisters quietly wondered if this new place was home, or just another stop on a road lined with disappointment. Inside, Thomas Hale moved through the kitchen with the steady purpose of a man used to providing for others without asking for thanks. The girls sat stiffly at the table, uncertain of their place, while his 3 sons exchanged cautious glances, unspoken questions passing between them. The meal was simple but filling, and when Thomas bowed his head in prayer, his voice was not the voice of a man who demanded obedience, but of one who asked humbly for peace and strength. After breakfast, the work began. Ella took to the kitchen, hands unsure but determined as she measured flour and kneaded dough. Ruth followed Abram to the henhouse where she gathered eggs while pretending not to notice his shy, sidelong glances. And June, with her wild curiosity, shadowed Silas as he tended to the garden, her laughter chasing the barn cats across the yard. The boys, awkward and rough-handed, spoke little, but watched closely, offering help without pride or pity. In the evenings, they gathered by the hearth where lamplight softened the rough edges of the day, and for the first time in months, the girls found themselves drifting to sleep without fear snapping at their heels. But shadows lingered beyond the warm walls of the ranch. In town, whispers crawled across bar counters and church pews, tongues wagging over Thomas Hale's sudden guardianship of 3 abandoned girls. Some claimed he was a saint, others a fool, and a few, poisoned by their own bitterness, painted him as something worse. Yet Thomas paid them no mind. He knew the prairie spoke louder than men's gossip, and it told him that no child should carry the shame of their father's sins. As the sun set on another long day, Ella found herself sitting beside Thomas on the porch, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. With the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest, she finally asked what had lingered in her mind since they left town. Why had he done it? Thomas didn't look at her as he answered, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. Because a man with a roof and a conscience can't leave children out in the cold, and beneath the wide western sky, where words were rare but true, a fragile trust began to grow, quiet as the wind in the grass. The quiet days at the Hale Ranch stitched themselves into a fragile routine, where the morning's work was honest and the evening's laughter felt almost like belonging. Yet beneath the steady rhythm, shadows from the past waited to break through. It was during one such morning when the sun rose slow and reluctant over the prairie that a lone rider appeared at the edge of the pasture, his figure slumped in the saddle, bottle swinging loosely from his hand. Amos Rourke, sober enough to find the ranch, but drunk enough to forget why he'd lost his daughters in the first place. Thomas Hale stood by the corral fence, boots planted steady in the dust as Amos approached, the man's words slurred but sharp, demanding his daughter's return home with him, as if they were nothing more than tools a man could sell and reclaim at will. The girls froze where they stood, hearts pounding against ribs still bruised from memories of his fists and his rage. But Thomas neither raised his voice nor his rifle. Instead, his quiet words cut deeper than any bullet, telling Amos that a father forfeits his claim the moment he trades his children for drink, and that these girls were no longer his burden to waste, but their own souls to protect. Amos spat into the dirt, fury rising like heat waves on the prairie, but even in his drunkenness, he saw the line Thomas had drawn in the sand, a line he could cross only once. With a curse and a promise of return, Amos turned his horse and vanished into the horizon's glare, leaving dust and dread in his wake. That night, the house sat still beneath a moonless sky, and the girls gathered near the kitchen stove, their eyes wide with questions too heavy to speak aloud. Thomas sat nearby, his hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee, saying nothing but letting his presence answer for him. He would protect them, as long as they chose to stay, and if Amos came again, he would not face a broken man standing alone, but a home that had chosen to fight for itself. In the days that followed, the ranch worked as before, the boys fixing fences and mending saddles, the girls tending to the garden and baking bread. But now their laughter felt stronger, braver, as though daring the world to try and steal it away again. And though the wind still carried whispers of trouble, the Hale Ranch stood firm, a small beacon of what kindness looked like when courage chose to stay quiet, but unyielding. The warning came on a restless wind just past sundown, when Eli spotted dust rising fast from the southern ridge, too swift for cattle and too scattered for travelers. And in that moment, Thomas Hale knew Amos Rourke was making good on his threat. He gathered his sons and the girls in the barnyard, voices low but steady, outlining where to stand, what to guard, and who would fire only if forced. This was not a home of war, but it would not be a home of surrender either. As the sky darkened, they waited by the fence line, the girls watching from the loft, hearts pounding against their ribs like the wild horses they'd once dreamed of riding. The hoofbeats drew closer, and soon Amos appeared with two shadowy figures riding at his side. Men from the next county, rough and desperate, drawn to easy trouble for the promise of coin or cruelty. Amos called across the fence, his voice thick with liquor and anger, demanding his daughter's return or face the price of defiance. Thomas stood calm, rifle resting across his arms, and answered with the weight of a man who feared neither lies nor death, saying that the girls were no longer his to claim, and that the only thing they owed Amos was the silence he'd earned the day he sold them like cattle. For a tense moment, the night held its breath. Then, one of Amos's men raised his pistol, aiming toward the barn where Ruth's shadow flickered against the lantern light. But before his finger could squeeze the trigger, Eli's shot cracked through the dusk, sharp and final, sending the pistol spinning into the dirt. Amos cursed, backing his horse a step, and in that flicker of hesitation, Thomas spoke once more, not with anger but quiet certainty, telling them to leave before the night swallowed them whole. The hired guns exchanged uneasy glances, measuring pay against pain, and turned their horses without another word. Alone now, Amos sat in his saddle, fury boiling but powerless without followers. He spat once at the fence and rode off into the darkness, his threats swallowed by the endless prairie. When the dust settled, Thomas lowered his rifle and turned to his family, because that's what they were now, forged not by blood but by choice, and offered them a small, tired smile. That night, as the wind finally calmed and the stars blinked into place, the Hale Ranch stood whole, its fences unbroken, its laughter faint but real in the quiet between storms. The days that followed passed with a quiet that felt too thin to trust, as if the wind itself waited for trouble to stir again. And soon enough it did. Not from Amos Rourke, but from Dust Creek itself, where whispers about Thomas Hale's defiance turned to outrage beneath the church steeple and saloon lamps. Men who'd once respected Thomas's quiet strength now gathered in small circles, muttering about how a rancher had no right to take in girls not his own, how a man protecting strangers risked tearing apart the fragile peace the town clung to. By week's end, the town council summoned Thomas to stand before them in the church hall, its cracked windows letting in the cold wind like judgment itself. The girls stayed home, watching the trail with anxious eyes, while Thomas rode alone into the storm of stares and questions. Inside, Reverend Crane cleared his throat and spoke first, his voice careful but firm, saying that the welfare of children was no man's private concern when the town's reputation hung in the balance. Others followed, accusing Thomas of impropriety, of harboring lost souls who ought to be sent to the county orphanage, where law and order ruled over mercy. Thomas listened, his hands resting calmly on the table before him, and when the voices quieted, he spoke with the steady conviction of a man who had already made peace with his choices. He told them that children were not livestock to be auctioned or discarded, that the mark of a man was measured not in how much land he owned, but in how fiercely he protected those with no one else to stand for them. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably, their anger cracking beneath the truth of his words, but others, harder of heart, remained unmoved, casting their votes to have the girls removed by week's end. Thomas left the hall without another word, knowing the law was not on his side, but trusting the land, the fences, and his family to hold until it was. Back at the ranch, the sun dipped low as he returned, his face lined with weariness but not defeat, and when Ella met him at the porch, searching his eyes for the answer she feared, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder and said that they would face whatever came, together. That night, they sat by the fire without speaking, letting the crackle of the logs and the quiet strength between them fill the space where fear tried to creep in. And outside, the prairie wind carried their resolve into the night like a prayer, not waiting for permission. The morning broke dry and brittle. The sky stretched thin and sharp above the Hale Ranch where decisions waited like vultures circling the distant hills. And it was Eli who rose first, stepping outside as the sun cracked over the horizon, his jaw tight with the weight of what the town had declared. He spent the morning repairing fence posts with a quiet fury, hammer striking wood in steady rhythm, his mind spinning on the thought of the orphanage wagon rolling down the road to take away the only family he and his brothers had ever truly known. Inside the house, Ella scrubbed the floors with trembling hands, her heart beating like a trapped bird, while Ruth packed a small bundle for June, just in case, though none of them spoke aloud the fear they all felt. By noon, a thin line of dust curled on the south trail, and there it was, the orphanage wagon, drawn by two tired mules, driven by Mr. Colton, the county man whose job it was to follow orders, not question them. Thomas stepped off the porch, rifle slung but not raised, and stood beside his sons, who lined up beside him without a word. Mr. Colton pulled the wagon to a stop, wiped the dust from his brow, and read from a folded paper, his voice awkward and apologetic, declaring that by vote of Dust Creek's council, the girls were to be removed from the Hale household and placed into the county's care until a more suitable arrangement could be found. Silence stretched between the men, taut as barbed wire, until Eli stepped forward, taller now than his father had realized, his voice steady but shaking at the edges as he spoke. He said that no vote could erase what had already been built here, that no council knew better than the people who'd shared bread, sweat, and laughter with those girls, and that if anyone meant to take them, they'd have to look each of them in the eye and explain why strangers could love them less than a quiet rancher and his sons. Mr. Colton lowered his paper, looking past the words he'd been told to read, and saw not a lawbreaker, but a family standing in the dust, bracing against a world too quick to tear apart what love had stitched together. With a long sigh, he tucked the paper back into his coat and turned his wagon around, muttering that the county had bigger troubles than breaking up homes that didn't ask for saving. As the dust settled in his wake, Thomas placed a steady hand on Eli's shoulder, pride soft but fierce in his chest, and for the first time in days, the wind across the prairie felt less like a warning and more like a blessing. Just when the dust seemed to settle and the Hale Ranch stood quiet beneath autumn skies, trouble came once more, not in the form of county men or council votes, but in the dark of night, when Amos Rourke, too proud to let go and too drunk to think straight, returned with fire in his hands and vengeance burning hotter than whiskey in his veins. While the family slept, flames roared to life along the east fence line, crackling through the dry brush and licking toward the barn where the livestock panicked in their stalls, their cries tearing through the night. Thomas woke first, boots on before the smoke reached the porch, shouting for water buckets and hands to hold the line. Eli and Abram raced to the well. Ruth and Ella formed a chain with trembling arms, and even little June carried pails too big for her small frame, her face streaked with ash but stubborn as stone. Amid the chaos, Thomas spotted Amos's figure silhouetted against the blaze, a matchstick still glowing between his fingers and a grin sharp as broken glass. And for the first time in years, Thomas's temper burned hotter than his restraint. He crossed the yard in long strides, tackling Amos to the ground as the fire hissed behind them, fists meeting a face that had known only cruelty and cowardice. Amos fought back with drunken rage, but Thomas's fury was clear and righteous, not wild and wasted. Eli pulled them apart before mercy drowned in anger, dragging his father back toward the flames where more needed saving than punishing. They worked until dawn, sweat and soot clinging to their skin, and when the last ember faded and the land smoldered quiet, they found themselves standing on scorched earth but still standing together. Amos was gone, limping into the morning haze, leaving behind the ruin of his hatred and nothing else. As the family gathered on the porch, faces blackened and shoulders sagging with exhaustion, Thomas spoke softly, his voice rough but sure. He told them that a home is not built of wood and nails, but of hearts that choose to stay, fight, and forgive. And though the barn could be rebuilt and fences mended, it was their bond that fire could never burn away. That night, as stars blinked gently overhead and the wind cooled the charred fields, the Hale family, by blood and by choice, found rest not in safety, but in each other's company. And for the first time in a long while, they knew that whatever storm waited beyond the horizon, they would face it as one. When the smoke from the fire drifted into Dust Creek the next morning, it carried whispers of what had happened at the Hale Ranch, and by midday the townsfolk gathered in uneasy clusters outside the mercantile in the churchyard, torn between their pride and the quiet guilt that settled like dust in their throats. Some argued that Thomas Hale had defied their votes and the law itself. Others said no law worth its ink would have left those girls to a man like Amos Rourke. And still others, mostly the wives and older men who had buried too many regrets, simply sighed and shook their heads at how long it had taken for them to see what was right in front of them. By afternoon, a slow procession of wagons and riders made its way to the Hale Ranch, not with torches or accusations, but with hammers, fence posts, and fresh-cut timber. Thomas watched them approach from the porch, his rifle leaning untouched against the wall, unsure whether to brace for trouble or relief. But when Reverend Crane stepped forward and tipped his hat with a quiet nod, Thomas understood. Something had shifted. They worked until sundown, fixing what fire had broken, speaking little but meaning much with every nail driven and every fence rebuilt. Even Colton, the county man, returned with new boots for June and flour sacks for the pantry, muttering that the girls deserved more than what the county ever offered. Eli and Abram worked alongside the men who once questioned their family's worth, while Ruth and Ella prepared bread and stew that filled the long tables beneath the oaks, their laughter mixing with the hammer strikes in a way that softened the hardest faces. No speeches were given, no formal apologies offered, only the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes a town takes too long to stand with the right people, and all it can do is start standing now. When the work was done and the prairie stretched wide and golden beneath the fading sun, Thomas stood with his family, daughters and sons alike, and saw for the first time a town that had finally looked up from its fear long enough to find its better self. As the neighbors loaded their tools and rode away, they left behind more than rebuilt barns and mended fences. They left behind a message clear as the western sky. The Hale Ranch wasn't just a home anymore. It was a part of Dust Creek's story, written not in property deeds or council votes, but in the hands that chose to help instead of harm. Autumn settled over the Hale Ranch with golden leaves and cool winds that whispered through the cottonwoods like a song finally remembered. And in that quiet season of harvest and healing, the family that had once been strangers became something solid and unshakable. Ella rose before dawn to bake bread, her laughter filling the kitchen alongside Ruth's as they braided dough and argued playfully over recipes their mother never had the chance to teach them. June chased the barn cats through the hayloft, her laughter brighter than the morning sun, while Silas built her a swing from an old rope and a sturdy oak branch, his quiet smile speaking the words he rarely said aloud. Eli and Abram split their days between mending fence posts and sneaking awkward glances toward the girls who, though once guests, now filled the house with a warmth deeper than blood. Thomas watched it all from the porch, coffee in hand, the burden of his choices lighter with each sunrise. There were still whispers in Dust Creek, as there always would be, but fewer now carried bitterness, and more carried respect. Neighbors stopped by with bolts of fabric and baskets of apples, not out of pity, but out of recognition that the Hale Ranch was a place where kindness lived louder than fear. Even the town council, prideful though they remained, had learned to keep their distance, their silence a quiet concession that perhaps justice was better served by leaving well enough alone. One cool Sunday, as the harvest moon rose high and silver, Thomas gathered the family beneath the open sky, where the prairie stretched endless and the stars bore silent witness. He spoke not as a rancher, nor as a man guarding what wasn't his, but as a father whose home was no longer borrowed, but built by choice. He told them that no law had tied them together, no preacher had blessed their union. But every fence they mended, every meal they shared, and every storm they faced had written their family into something deeper than paper could ever hold. In that moment, beneath the autumn sky, Ella, Ruth, and June stood taller, not as girls taken in from pity, but as daughters who had fought for a home and found it, while Eli, Abram, and Silas stood beside them, no longer boys alone on the land, but brothers by heart, if not by name. As the wind carried their laughter into the night, Thomas smiled, knowing the road ahead would bring troubles and trials like any other life. But this time, they would meet them as a family, and no fire, vote, or drunken threat would ever change that.